Iran thought missiles and drones would be enough. 47 years of revolutionary rhetoric, 47 years of resistance economy propaganda, 47 years of telling the world that the Islamic Republic cannot be broken by external pressure. And then, in the space of 18 days, a United States naval blockade did what decades of sanctions, embargoes, and resolutions could not. It found the one pressure point that the regime had no answer for. Not the missiles, not the nuclear program, not the proxy network stretching from Beirut to Sana'a, the oil, the artery, the singular source of revenue that funds everything else. And now Iran is raising what looks very much like a white flag, not in the language of formal surrender, in the language of numbers, in the language of tankers, in the language of a president asking his people to turn on 2 lights instead of 10. This is Professor Jiang. The story of Iran's energy collapse is the most consequential economic story of this conflict, and it is unfolding in real time with a precision that every intelligence agency, every oil market, and every government in the world is tracking simultaneously. I want to give you the complete picture, every verified data point, every mechanism, every timeline, and every implication, because the numbers behind this collapse are more alarming than any military threat either side has made publicly. Subscribe now, because what is happening to Iran's oil infrastructure right now cannot be undone by diplomacy. The damage being done in these days is permanent in ways that the bombs were not. Start with the number that the maritime intelligence firm Kepler published this week, and that Bloomberg Al Jazeera Business Standard and every serious energy publication carried immediately. Iran has between 12 and 22 days of unused crude oil storage capacity remaining. That is it. 12 to 22 days before the tanks are full, before the oil has nowhere to go, before the wells that are still pumping into a system with no outlet must be shut in. Kepler is not an alarmist. They are the firm whose satellite data tracks every tanker in the world's oceans. Their analysts have direct visibility into Iran's storage infrastructure and the loading data at Iranian ports. When Kepler says 12 to 22 days, they are reading the actual fill levels of actual tanks. The mechanism that produced this crisis is documented in 3 numbers that tell the entire story. In March 2026, Iran was exporting 1.85 million barrels of crude oil per day. After the U.S. naval blockade began on April 13th, that number crashed to 567,000 barrels per day by late April, a collapse of approximately 70%. And in the same period, Goldman Sachs estimated Iran had already curtailed as much as 2.5 million barrels of daily crude production. The oil is still being pumped from the wells at reduced but still substantial rates into storage infrastructure that was never designed to function as a permanent depot, because it was always designed to flow through to tankers. The tankers are blocked, the storage is filling, the wells are still running. The math produces 12 to 22 days until the system seizes. Kepler's senior analysts put a specific number on what comes next. If the blockade persists past the storage capacity window, Iran could be forced to cut another 1.5 million barrels per day of production by midday. Add that to the 2.5 million already cut per Goldman Sachs' estimate, and Iran is facing a scenario where its total crude output falls to approximately 1.2 to 1.3 million barrels per day against a pre-war level of around 3.3 million. That is a 60% reduction in the productive output of one of the largest oil reserve holders on the planet, achieved not by bombing oil fields, but by blocking the ports through which the oil has to leave. But here is the dimension of this collapse that most coverage is not giving sufficient weight. The permanent dimension, the distinction that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was pointing at when he used the specific word fragile to describe Iranian oil wells. In petroleum engineering, when a producing well is forced to shut in under emergency conditions rather than planned operational procedures, the reservoir dynamics change. The water table below the oil column, which reservoir pressure had been holding down, begins to migrate upward into the producing zone. This process is called water coning, and it is irreversible. When the well is reopened, it produces not just oil, but increasing proportions of water, permanently degrading its productive capacity. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies estimates the permanent production loss from a forced mass shut-in at 300 to 500,000 barrels per day, not temporary, permanent 9 to 5 billion per year, every year thereafter, permanently subtracted from whatever Iran's post-conflict revenue picture looks like. This is the horror that Besson's statements have been encoding, and that the KPL data is now making concrete. The diplomatic conversation about reopening the strait is being conducted as if a deal tomorrow restores Iran's oil industry tomorrow. It does not. The damage accumulating right now in Iran's reservoir geology will not be repaired by any document signed in any hotel in Islamabad. The Chabahar dimension is where the story moves from crisis to something approaching catastrophe for the Iranian strategic position. Chabahar port on Iran's southeastern coast in the Gulf of Oman was supposed to be Iran's Plan B, the route that bypasses Hormuz entirely. The port that India spent years developing, the gateway of the international north-south transport corridor backed by China and Russia. The asset Thrawn pointed to whenever analysts asked, what happens if Hormuz gets blocked? Now look at Chabahar. On a normal day, 5 ships would be maroed there. Today, more than 20 tankers and cargo vessels sit jammed and waiting for reporting. This is providing confirmed across multiple outlets, because the U.S. Navy does not only enforce its blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, it enforces it in the Gulf of Oman, in the Arabian Sea, in the Bay of Bengal, in the Indian Ocean between Sri Lanka and Indonesia. Every Iran-linked vessel in every ocean is a potential target. Chabahar is in the Gulf of Oman. The Gulf of Oman is where the USS Spruant fired 3 rounds into the Tuska's engine room on April 19th. Plan B is now a parking lot of stranded tankers. The India element makes this worse by an order of magnitude. India's investment in Chabahar was the geopolitical justification for the port's strategic significance. Indian infrastructure, Indian capital, Indian interest in Central Asian connectivity through Iran. That investment has now stalled, and reporting confirmed. India signed a new contract with UAE's Fujairah port infrastructure, moving its operational focus to a facility that bypasses Iran entirely. Iran is losing not just a port, but the country whose involvement gave that port its strategic legitimacy. Even Iran's partners are calculating that the cost of being associated with Chabahar now exceeds the benefit of whatever access it was supposed to provide. And then there is the UAE decision that hit Tehran harder than any single development since the blockade began. The United Arab Emirates left OPEC, not quietly, not apologetically. The UAE Energy Minister, Suhail al-Mazzoui, told CNN directly, the timing is right because the Strait of Hormuz is closed and the impact on the market will be limited. He said it out loud. He connected the exit explicitly to the Hormuz closure. The UAE is leaving OPEC because the closure of the strait created the window in which its exit costs the least. While its strategic benefit is the greatest, the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, 380 kilometers of infrastructure connecting Abu Dhabi's inland fields directly to the Gulf of Oman without passing through Hormuz, is the physical expression of why the UAE's OPEC exit is devastating to Iran's energy strategy. Since March 2026, exports through Fujairah have surged 57%. The pipeline is currently pumping approximately 1.9 million barrels per day. By exiting OPEC, the UAE is freed from production quotas and can increase that flow by up to an additional million barrels per day, independent of any multilateral agreement. This is not the UAE being aggressive toward Iran. This is the UAE doing what every sovereign energy producer does, maximizing its position in a market where its competitor has been eliminated from effective competition. Iran's Hormuz leverage card assumed that the world would have no alternative supply route when Hormuz was closed. The Fujairah pipeline, running at near capacity, is the alternative supply route that is making that assumption false in real time. OPEC's share of global supply control has dropped from 30 to 26% as a direct consequence of the UAE departure. For Iran, that number is catastrophic, not because Iran needs OPEC's institutional framework for its own exports, which have already been sanctioned for years, but because OPEC's production discipline was one of the mechanisms keeping oil prices high enough that Iran's sanctioned discounted exports still generated meaningful revenue. When prices are high, selling Iranian crude at a $30 discount to benchmark still produces substantial cash. When the UAE's additional million barrels per day puts downward pressure on price, while Iran's export volume has collapsed 70%, the combination is what the mathematics of energy economics describes as a two-front loss. Volume is down, price is falling, Revenue is approaching zero. The document that may represent the single most alarming piece of intelligence about Iran's internal condition, leaked by Iran International on April 27th, needs to be read in full. The Supreme National Security Council, chaired by Zalatar, the IRGC hardliner installed over Pezeshkian's objection, convened on an emergency basis and reached three conclusions. First, protests could break out again within days, with economic pressure already functioning as the primary trigger. Second, the regime can withstand the blockade for at most 6 to 8 weeks from the date of the meeting. Third, by the end of spring, approximately 2 million jobs could be lost in the private sector. Security officials summarize the overall assessment in a single sentence whose directness is remarkable even by the standards of internal government documents. Unrest is inevitable, only its timing is uncertain. Read that again. The Supreme National Security Council of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the body that coordinates the regime's security decisions, has put in writing that unrest is coming, and the only question is when. This is not an opposition analysis. This is not a U.S. intelligence assessment. This is the regime's own security apparatus documenting in official language that the social contract is dissolving and that the timeline for its dissolution is measured in weeks. The internet shutdown that has run for 62 consecutive days, one of the longest national shutdowns in the history of the internet, per CBS News' confirmed reporting, is both a symptom and an accelerant of this condition. 90 million Iranians cut off from the global digital economy. Online businesses in fashion, fitness, advertising, and retail have had their revenue evaporate. The shutdown that was imposed as a wartime security measure is destroying the digital economic layer that a generation of young Iranians built specifically to survive the physical economic constraints of the sanctions era. The regime has suppressed the internet. It cannot suppress the consequences of suppressing it. Pezeshkian's state television address on April 25th is the human face of what the SNSC document describes in cold, bureaucratic language. He told the Iranian people to turn on 2 lights instead of 10. Government offices operating on half-day schedules. Street lights cut by half in Isfahan and Tray. The TAN metro heating reduced and cut repeatedly. Imported medicine prices up 60%. Lines for bread, meat, and milk growing longer in cities that had not seen food queues in this form since the 1980s war with Iraq. Iran produces 1.85 million barrels of crude oil per day in normal conditions. It can no longer find a route through which to sell any of it. And a president is asking his citizens to use fewer lights. The proxy network dimension is where the financial collapse extends from domestic crisis to strategic collapse simultaneously. Every element of Iran's regional influence projection requires money. Hezbollah's salaries, Houthi drone production, Iraqi Shia militia operational budgets, Syrian logistics networks, all of it funded from the oil revenue that the blockade has reduced by 70%. Reports confirm Hezbollah has reached the point of being unable to pay regular salaries. The Houthi forces in Yemen are operating on depleted drone stockpiles with no confirmed resupply. Iraqi Shia militias have pulled back from field operations because no funding has arrived. The proxy war network that the IRGC spent 40 years and hundreds of billions of dollars constructing is being financially dismantled, not by military action against the proxies, but by a naval blockade that cut the treasurer off from the network simultaneously. White House official confirmed to CNBC that TAN is losing $500 million per day due to the blockade. $500 million per day, $15 billion per month. The IRGC cannot maintain its own payroll, fund its proxy network, pay its security forces, subsidize the consumer goods that hold the social contract together, and finance the missile and drone programs that constitute its military deterrent, simultaneously on revenues that have fallen 70% from already sanctioned levels. Iran is now reactivating 30-year-old scrap tankers as floating oil storage. The Nasha, an aging vessel that should by any commercial logic be sitting in a shipbreaker's yard in Bangladesh, has been brought back into service to hold crude oil that has nowhere else to go. When a country starts using vessels consigned to the scrapyard as overflow storage for its primary export commodity, the physical expression of economic desperation has no diplomatic euphemism available to soften it. 3 scenarios remain, and each is more consequential than the last. Iran backs down on the nuclear question and agrees to the comprehensive deal that Trump's 5 red lines require. It resists the SNSC's internal timeline of 6 to 8 weeks expires, and the streets produce the unrest that the regime's own Security Council has already described as inevitable. Or the conflict escalates to a third phase of military operations against infrastructure that Besant and Trump have both publicly described as the remaining pressure option. None of these scenarios produces a clean outcome. All of them produce consequences that the global economy, which is already pricing Brent above $110, has not yet fully priced in. Iran hung itself with its own rope the moment it chose to close the Strait of Hormuz rather than protect its oil revenue. The strategy that was supposed to give it maximum leverage has produced maximum vulnerability. It cannot sell the oil that funds the military that is holding the strait closed. The IRGC is blocking the deal that would relieve the economic pressure that is destroying the IRGC's own financial base. The regime's own Security Council is writing surrender documents dressed as threat assessments. And somewhere in a secret location, whose coordinates only the IRGC knows, a wounded supreme leader who has not spoken publicly in 62 days is the one person whose authorization could end all of it. The countdown is not a metaphor. It is 12 to 22 days of storage ticking down in real time, one barrel at a time. This is Professor Jiang.